record. Thanks to for the reminder from my colleagues. So I'll start again. I'm going to call two roles. The first role will be the names of committee members and alternates of committee members. After each name is called, the person should say here so we can make sure their mics are working. The second role will be the names of ACUS members who are not on the committee and alternates. After each name is called, the person should say here so we can make sure their mics are working. I will not call names of members of the public who do not have speaking privileges. All right. Any questions at this point? All right, if not, I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Andy Foyce, for some opening remarks. Andy.
Thanks very much, Ben. Welcome everyone to this first subcommittee or first committee meeting working on individualized guidance. Look forward to your amendments and your discussion to hopefully get this to the council and finally for the assembly to adopt a strong, robust recommendation. First, many people to thank. Thank you to our chair, our Bertrand, for the work he'll do today with you and future meetings and at the council and at the plenary session in June. Thank you very much to Shalini Ray for an excellent comprehensive report. I also thank all those that she thanked in footnote 1. And thank you to Ben Burkhill for his excellent ongoing work on the report, with the report, and with these first draft of recommendation. One shout out to Bertrand, an extra thanks because he was a guest on the April edition of the ACUS website and streaming show Between the Lines, talking about virtual public engagement and rulemaking. So if anyone has an opportunity to listen to that, you can also check out the chair. Many of you know this is not the first time that ACUS has taken up the subject of guidance, and I was happy to see that history reflected in the first section of the report. Shalini writes in the report that the balance inherent in the individualized guidance is one of the, quote, most fundamental trade-offs in administrative law, and it's difficult to argue with that. And it's that observation speaks to why ACUS chose to undertake this effort to build on its past work. And it also speaks to our desire that the recommendations will help agencies to find that balance. And I think it's important that as agencies do that and seek to strike the balance, that the value of individualized guidance that we all recognize doesn't result in strengthening deep pocket parties' ability to box out agency enforcement. So I'm sure we'll all be keeping an eye on that. Overall, I think the topic raises a lot of interesting questions. Shalini nailed all of them. Both legal issues and practical considerations. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, to your amendments, and to working with you in the coming weeks and months. So Ben, should I turn things over to Bertrand?
So I'm going to take it back real quick and do the roll real quick, and then I will turn it over to Bertrand. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, so I'm going to call the roll. First, I'll start with committee members. Laura Barheit.
I'm on.
Great, thanks. Emily Hammond.
I'm here.
Thank you. Nina Mendelsohn.
Here.
Thank you. Elena Ness. All right. Nick Perillo.
Here.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Ray Peeler.
I'm here.
Thanks, Ray. Mitch Clave. I'm not hearing anything. Going once. David Pritzker.
I'm here.
Thanks. Kevin Stack.
Morning here.
Thank you. Jessica Stone,
I'm here.
Tom Sussman,
Here.
great. Susan Webb Yackey. Okay. Those were the committee members. Are there any committee members that are present that I did not call? Again, just if you're a committee member, and if you're not sure, you can wait. All right, great. I'll call the non-committee members. Jeff Lubbers.
Here.
Thanks. Bill Funk.
Here.
Thank you. Matt Weiner.
I'm here, thank you.
Ron Levin. I think I
Here.
saw him, but yeah, thanks.
I'm here.
And then Tim Mullins.
Here.
Thanks, Tim. All right, that concludes my call of the rolls for folks who responded. Is there anyone who is present whose name I have not called? Don't see any hands raised. All right, and I think we'll have some folks joining later. I think the folks that may join later possibly are Andrew Emery, may join briefly at the end. And I believe there was one more person who said they might join later. So we'll keep an eye out for them. And at this point, unless there are any questions, I'll turn it over to our committee chair, Bertrell Ross. Bertrell?
Hello, everyone. It's been a minute since we last had a chance to engage, and I'm looking forward to our conversation over the next few meetings, 3 meetings probably. Thanks, Andy, for the opening remarks and the introduction, Ben, for your great work on this project, and Shalini for the great report that we'll discuss and will be the focal point of our recommendations with respect to individual guidance. So I'll start by reading the standard protocol. Over the past year since we met as a committee, my eyesight has diminished seemingly greatly. My years of avoiding glasses are coming to an end, but I forgot them today, so I'll read it best I can. And then I'll describe in terms of the process going forward with respect to how we'll engage the individual guidance recommendation. And then I'll turn it over to Shalini to describe the provide brief remarks on the report. Okay, so start with the standard protocol. Now, please note that only ACUS members, including government members, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels, whether or not on the committee and their designated alternatives, have full speaking privileges. To avoid background noise, though, I'd ask that you keep your microphone on mute and either use Zoom's hand raise feature or add a comment in the chat feature if you'd like to speak. I'll then call on you and you can unmute yourself. Please then remute yourself when you're done. I'd also ask that ACUS members and their designated alternates use a webcam to facilitate conversation. With respect to attendees other than ACUS members and alternates, participation requires a unanimous consent of the committee members. Time permitting, I'll consider calling on such attendees at appropriate points, and will presume that committee members consent absent their raising an objection. If any such participant would like to speak, please so indicate in the chat feature or by using Zoom's hand raise feature and wait to speak until I call on you. You can then unmute yourself and please remute yourself when you're done speaking. For all participants, please use the chat feature only to indicate that you'd like to speak, or for committee members and their alternates to vote when asked. Please do not hold any sidebar discussions or put substantive comments in the chat feature. Only members of the Committee on Rulemaking, including government members and their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels, have a vote. Please do not vote unless you're a member of the committee. We have a list of committee members in case you are unsure. So that's the standard meeting protocols. And if there are any questions about that, please feel free to raise your hand. And as in terms of how we'll proceed, we'll have the consultant presentation by Shalini Ray, and then we will engage the recommendations and we'll the report with the recommendations, and we'll focus on the recommendations first and then return to the preamble at the end if time permits. Are there any questions in terms of the process? Anyone has? Okay, so all standard. So let me turn it over to Shalini Ray, who will provide a high-level overview of the report, including the research underpinning it and the bases for the suggested recommendations.
Thank you very much, Bertrell. I'm Shalini Ray, and I'm a professor at the University of Alabama School of Law, and I was delighted to serve as the consultant for this study. And I wanted to add a huge thanks to Matt Weiner for comments on the draft report. I will reflect that ultimately in the final footnote, but it's very, very helpful. So this study set out to answer a number of questions that were identified in the RFP. You know, how do people request individualized guidance? How do agencies produce it? How is it disseminated? And ultimately, how is it used, either by the requesting party or third parties, members of the public more broadly? But of course, before getting to those questions, there's a very large question looming, which is, what is individualized guidance? And that was a question that we didn't really set out to answer, but of course, we have a lot of thoughts about it and talk to agency personnel about what it means to them. So for the purposes of this report, we didn't come out with a definitive stance of, you know, whether individualized guidance is best characterized as a type of non-legislative rulemaking, or whether it might better be characterized as a type of informal adjudication. In fact, that, you know, there has been some recent robust debate on that among scholars in the field. And so this report doesn't stake out a position in that exact debate. The definition that I use in the report has to do with sort of questions regarding how the law applies to proposed conduct by a requesting party. And I think the draft recommendation has a slightly broader definition. It's not limited to questions about prospective conduct, but sort of how the law applies to specific circumstances that the requester is facing. So that was sort of the working definition that we used and that we kind of our questions were based on. And in the course of this study, you know, we wanted to answer those questions in the RFP, and the method that we used was a series of interviews with current and former agency personnel. There were a handful of interviews with people who really had no agency affiliation at all, had never worked in an agency and were not currently in one. But there were very few such individuals with sort of pure private sector background. I did 32 interviews between September and I think the last one actually was just in the new year. I did one last interview because I couldn't resist, January 2nd. So from September to January, we did interviews and then kind of reflected on, you know, the comments and the answers that we got. And then, you know, I set out to write this draft report. So I wanted to share just a few of the key takeaways. I think one of the principal findings of the report is that there is a great deal of variation in how agencies approach and think about individualized guidance. So I think I phrase it as sort of agencies vary in their willingness to advise. And that was surprising. I think I'd assumed that agencies probably all, you know, give advice and think that it's part of their job, but that was not the case. So we found that some agencies are very self-conscious about not providing individualized guidance, and some, you know, of course, have provided it and continue to provide it on a regular basis, and are enthusiastically so. Some see it as squarely part of their mission. Others see it as, you know, really not part of their job, or maybe resources are insufficient, or the costs exceed the benefits in their view. So the report goes into more detail on factors that shape agencies' attitudes and willingness to provide individualized guidance. The other principal finding, I think, is that there is quite a bit of variation in the advice that's given. So how formal it is, whether the individualized guidance is contemplated by the agency's organic statute, or whether it's purely a discretionary service provided by the agency. We saw some variation there. And then, you know, some is written, some is in a sort of formal kind of letter ruling or advisory opinion. We found instances where agencies provide individualized guidance by email, in some instances over the phone. And so there's some variation there. And then I think there's another set of features that varied across agencies. So relating to how much parties can rely on the advice given, whether it's perceived by the agency as binding on them, and whether if parties can rely on it, is it limited to the requesting party, or is there potential for third parties to be able to rely on the advice that the agency gives? And so we saw variation on a lot of these dimensions. And I would be happy to answer questions about specific areas if that would be useful.
Thank you, Shalini, for your remarks on the report. And again, thanks for the excellent work with the report. So I think that right now, are there any questions for Shalini at this point? You want to raise it? Okay. So I think the next step would be for Ben to put up on the screen the recommendation. Is
So I'll
that
put it
right?
up on the screen and then, yep, and let me know if anyone has trouble seeing it on the Zoom.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Okay. Okay.
Folks seeing that okay? You should see the numbers on the left side, the text and the comments on the right side.
Yep. Yes, Ron, you have a hand up? Ron Levin?
Yes, so I'm an interloper here, but Ben invited me to join because I've done some previous work on guidance in the Judicial Review Committee on the interpretive rule and policy statement side. And I think it's an excellent report. It really covers a lot of ground in a very organized way, gives me a lot of detail about things that I'd vaguely heard about, but now we have a lot more detail and really very well expressed. Then, of course, all too few studies cite my work, and even fewer cited accurately, but she did, so that's a plus. What I wanted to raise at this beginning is that there's a situation that seems like it could potentially fall within the scope of the recommendation, but I think probably doesn't, but might merit mention. Andy mentioned that this topic is adjacent to the conference's work in the area of enforcement. And it occurred to me as I was reading the recommendation that you might have a kind of what you could loosely call guidance, which is not solicited by the private person, but rather is the agency reaching out to say, you know, we've heard that you are engaging in X conduct, and that looks like it could be in tension with our mission, and you really ought to think about that again and be in touch with us and re-examine what you're doing. Or it might say, we just found that somebody who's doing a lot of the same stuff you're doing was in violation of our statute, and you ought to take heed, etc. Now, I think that would fall within the literal meaning of individualized guidance as the recommendation defines it, and yet I don't think really that is intended. When I got to the report, I saw nothing like that is anything that Shalini has addressed. So it seemed to me that there are two possibilities. One is this never happens. It's a total fantasy by myself. And it's not even worth mentioning because it has no real world referent. Or two, it would be appropriate to say, yes, it happens, but it's not within the scope of what we're studying here. And so don't assume that it is.
So let me turn this first over to Shalini to get a sense in terms of your interviews with agency personnel, whether you have a take as to whether this happens or not.
Yeah, we didn't really see or hear, I should say, evidence of it. Now, of course, we were not asking about it, so that's always I can't say that, you know, it definitely doesn't exist, but it doesn't seem like something that agencies were spending much time thinking about in our experience.
I guess as a committee, we should discuss in terms of, you know, it doesn't mean that it's not happening, whether we want to just specify that that's not within the scope of this report, something for the committee to consider going forward. Let me turn it over to Nina, and then I'll turn it over to Nicholas.
Hi, thanks for a great report. My question is actually remarkably similar to Ron's, but with a slightly different spin. I too wondered if agencies might be reaching out to invite requests for individualized guidance but with the notion that maybe they were establishing kind of safe zones, areas where they might be signaling, for example, that they might not enforce, but doing it through an individualized guidance approach rather than kind of a broad statement of policy. But because to my mind, that might raise broader concerns about public engagement with people who might expect the statutory regime to be enforced in those settings. So, but it sounds like you didn't get any indication, you didn't specifically ask this question, and you didn't get any indication that individualized guidance is ever really initiated by the agency.
Shalini, do you have a response to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, one of the premises of the project was really that the request is coming from outside, from a member of the public. So I think it's safe to say it just wasn't within the scope of what we were looking at, and it didn't kind of come up organically in the interviews.
So given these questions on these types of guidance, maybe we should consider adding to report some clarification in terms of, or the recommendations, whether that this recommendation does or does not address these types of guidance. And I think that that's something that the committee should discuss today. Nicholas.
Yes, thanks. Just on this point, I mean, my sense is that what Ron is describing does happen in a very significant way at several agencies. One example being FDA warning letters, potentially U.S. Department of Agriculture notices of noncompliance, that kind of thing. And I think at a lot of agencies, much of the actual enforcement activity takes place through this relatively non-formal guidance before any official enforcement proceeding begins. I took Shalini's framing of the inquiry, as she just said, to very much be about guidance that is issued at the voluntary request of the stakeholder, of the regulated party, and I think that's already the way the report is written, and perhaps it would be good to have some additional clarifying language that's kind of what the nature of the subject matter is. I mean, warning letters, broadly speaking, would really be a separate project.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that since Shalini's research didn't center on those types of guidance, I think it's appropriate for us to scope into the types of guidance that Shalini was focused on in her report. So yeah, I think it's important to make that clear in the report. Yes, Jeffrey.
Yes, this discussion makes me wonder whether we should think about the title too. And maybe, I mean, individual guidance given at the request of the public, or, I mean, it's a little clunky, but I mean, if we're going to have a disclaimer about this, maybe the title should make it clear too. I'm just suggesting it. I don't have a strong feeling.
Yeah. Do others have thoughts? I mean, I guess that's an appropriate starting point. Do others have thoughts on the title and whether it's appropriate to amend in light of these accounts of alternative ways of producing guidance?
I like Nina's suggestion.
Agency treatment request for individual. Okay. Other sort of suggestions, thoughts? Nina?
Yeah, it does seem like Ron and Nick and I are all raising kind of other categories of issues. I like Nick's suggestion as well. Sorry. These are issues about agency experimentation with enforcement priorities, right? Where the agency issues a warning letter and then gets a request. And then my concern is really about systematic non-enforcement, which might have, public facing implications. But it might be that we do want to more expressly bracket at least some of these issues and make clear that that's not what this recommendation is addressing.
Okay. So we will take a turn on an express bracketing of these issues with the with the revisions to this recommendation. And then we'll come back to the committee at the next meeting to see if that bracketing is appropriate. And if it's not, we'll then discuss further what other types of bracketing or what that bracketing should look like. If that's okay. Any other preliminary comments, either in response to Shalini's report, or general comments before we jump into the recommendations? Okay. So my plan here will to go one by one, and I will, announce when we've moved from one to the other, give you some time to read it, a minute or so to read it, and then ask for comments and feedback. And then we'll go from there. We'll probably leave much of the wordsmithing to the committee on style, but if there's substantive changes that we seek to make to the recommendations, we'll try to address them here at this meeting. Okay. Okay. Without further ado, we'll start with recommendation 1. So any comments or feedback on recommendation 1? Okay. Not hearing any requests for comments.
And I did want to note, Bertrand, that we had put in a question for the committee about whether the recommendation should address circumstances, resources aside, under which the use of individualized guidance is or is not appropriate. So there's kind of broader policy questions surrounding the provision of individualized guidance.
Sorry, thank you for catching that. I have
That's my job.
my pictures of people covering your comments. Okay. Okay, yes, Nina.
Yeah, this question 1 just seems to implicate the bracketing issue that we were just discussing. That's all. That's my only comment. Assuming that we address that satisfactorily, recommendation 1 looks fine to me.
Okay. Thanks, Nina. Bill.
It was the report recognized that not all agencies do give individual guidance and actually affirmatively think it's not worth it. Now, here we're going to make a recommendation that says they should do it. And that's fine with me, but we're aware that we're telling some people to do something that they have thought about doing and have decided not to do already. That's sort of a question.
And Bill, just kind of following up, do you think that the caveat consistent with agency resources doesn't cover all those scenarios in which an agency might choose not to issue individual guidance?
It doesn't seem to me to be. It seems like how much individual guidance you give and how you give it would be consistent with it, but it doesn't seem to hold out the idea of agencies may decide not to do it, period. It seems like it's a very positive statement, and people who don't want to do it, of course, these are recommendations. They don't have to do it. And I favor the recommendation says that they should. But I just want to call out that this is something where we're telling people who we know aren't doing it that they should be doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization of the report generally, that it is oriented towards recommending that agencies, issue these when they can, but the question is whether that's appropriate or not. So we'll start with Nicholas, and then we'll turn to David and Jeffrey.
I had a question for Shalini. If the recommendation were to lay out the circumstances in which this would or wouldn't be appropriate, what do you think they should be?
And Shalini?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I guess in some ways I'll sort of avoid it by saying I think agencies are getting requests for advice probably regardless of whether they want to be receiving them. And so there's a way in which there's kind of an inevitability, I think, about at least, some advice giving. Even the agencies that are really against it, sometimes it's happening really informally, or they may not know at a high level, so that's one point that's not directly responsive. I mean, it's an interesting question. In what settings is it sort of most warranted advice giving? It seems like with agencies doing benefits adjudication, they're very reluctant to kind of advise people on how to successfully obtain benefits, in their adjudicatory process. And so I think there might be I think further sort of thought and reflection would be called for about sort of if there's subject matter limitations, where advice is maybe more appropriate or less appropriate. But I don't feel I don't know that in this meeting we could necessarily come up with that.
So, I mean, so Shalini, that seems like with the benefit setting, would it be right to characterize their reluctance as resource driven? They are dealing with so
I
many.
mean, I think in what we saw in the interviews, there are a number of agencies where their concept of what their job is maybe is sort of also a big part of their reluctance. It's not just resources.
Okay.
And so the report talks about a whole set of factors. I don't know if all of those need to be referenced here in the recommendations, but I think it probably is broader than just resource limitations.
Okay. Thank you, Shalini. David?
Seems a little odd to me that we start off our recommendations on this subject to say that if somebody asks a question, we're saying the agency should respond in writing. That seems to me that shouldn't be so automatic. There can be requests that would require fewer resources and would satisfy the immediate need of the requester. Also, line 56, I think the word individual is superfluous there. But my main point is that I think we should not start off by saying, when you ask a question, the agency should provide a written answer.
Now, Shalini, is there a reason why, or do you have thoughts on terms of written guidance as opposed to other forms of guidance that you described, some over email or over phone? Is there, do you have a sense in terms of the value of written guidance and whether it's within the capacity of agencies to provide written guidance?
Yeah, I might actually ask for Ben's input here on his thoughts about the limitation described here, written guidance. I mean, we did see individualized guidance being provided in lower cost ways, which I think are valuable. So I don't know that agencies, should be encouraged to always reduce advice to a writing necessarily. So Ben, I don't know if you have thoughts on this language.
Yeah, and that's the scope of the project, is it only
Yeah.
pertains to written guidance. And then the question is, to what extent should agencies be providing guidance in writing in response to requests that could come in orally? I mean, they could come in via email and they could be fairly informal. And so the question is, does it make sense to spend agency resources to respond to them in writing? I think that's a really good question. It's something that's not addressed in this first recommendation, but something we can think about. Because it goes back to this resource question of like, there are certain kinds of questions that it doesn't make sense probably for the agency to use their resources to respond to via writing. It might make sense to respond to them orally, or we may talk about it might make sense not to respond at all. And some agencies have that kind of process about when they don't respond. We can talk about that later. But yeah, I think that's the good question that's not currently addressed. I'm just kind of making some notes here. I'll make them on the body of the document as well. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, it's interesting. It builds in a limit on guidance, and to the extent that there is recommendation to provide written guidance, because I think providing written guidance would be less consistent with agency resources than providing other forms of guidance. So there is that aspect of it. Jeffrey.
Yeah, just on this last point, I think, the IRS does provide telephone advice to people when they call up with questions about their taxes. And of course, that all relates to the whole doctrine of equitable estoppel. The government can't be held, to provide benefits, when they've given bad advice. And maybe that's something that we should say too, but somewhere. But in terms of the the word agencies in the first line, I mean, there are lots of different types of agencies, of course. So I don't think the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission is going to provide advice to people because they're just purely an adjudicatory agency. I'm not sure ACUS would fit this this definition in this paragraph. The Department of Defense, so maybe we're talking about agencies primarily. It seems like we're talking about agencies with enforcement responsibilities, but maybe some benefits. But when I think of the report, it maybe Shalini can say remind me which agencies you talked to, but were they mostly agencies that had enforcement responsibilities?
Shalini.
Yeah, so quite a few were agencies with enforcement responsibilities, and I think the value of individualized guidance in that setting was to maybe ward off a downstream enforcement action if people can get advice about the agency's views early on. So certainly many were, but we did talk to a lot of agencies that adjudicate applications for benefits and other kinds of agencies as well. So I think we talked to a pretty wide range of personnel, and I think probably the agencies that are currently most likely to provide written individualized guidance do have some sort of enforcement function.
So you wouldn't expect OSHRIC to be covered, but you'd expect
Sure.
OSHRIC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess that kind of turns to the question whether we want to add additional caveats to that first recommendation. And if there is suggested amended language that anyone has, I want to not forget what David suggested with respect to deleting the word individual in line 56 as redundant. And if there's any objections to that, please do raise your hand. Ron.
Yeah, I don't think I heard what David said about the word individual.
Yeah, I think David said it was redundant, but I don't want to put.
It seems to me to be superfluous.
Superfluous.
Oh, I see. Okay. I think based on what I've heard, I think you might want to change written guidance to oral or written guidance, and not take a position in paragraph 1 about limiting it. On the other caveats, I think these could be addressed through the opening clause or phrase in line 55. You could say consistent with agency resources and priorities and the nature of their missions, or respective nature, maybe. Now, saying maybe priorities is giving them too much latitude. If they look at it, and the agencies that Bill Funk wants to give a nudge to says, oh, well, it's not our priority, so we won't do it. Maybe we don't want to say that, but that I think is a question for the committee, of which I'm not a member. And the nature of their mission would speak to the Department of Defense, OSHRIC, et cetera, examples where it's not likely that they're going to give guidance.
So does a member of the committee want to propose that change of language that Ron has suggested?
Sure.
Okay. And so the change of language has been proposed, and are there objections or comments on those two amendments to the recommendation? Yes, Bill.
I guess I got my hand up too fast there. I just wanted to say that it's not just enforcement agencies, because you have all sorts of contracting agencies. People want advice as to what they can do under the contract, benefits agencies that make conditions on benefits. People need information about that. So I just wanted to make clear, it's not just enforcement agencies. Of course, there are agencies that, like ACUS, that are not likely to get questions from the public. But it's not just enforcement agencies.
Okay. David.
Having raised the question about whether it needs to be written, I had no problem with inserting written or oral, but I just want you to be aware of the fact that there's a specific statement in the preamble that says we're not talking about oral advice.
Okay.
So we need to figure out whether
Right.
we want to say that or not.
Right. And we'll come back to the preamble at the end, but I think it's important to keep that in mind that we have shifted this recommendation to oral guidance, and there might be other instances in which we refer to written guidance further down in the recommendation. So if we do decide to adopt these changes, we will have to make amendments to the preamble and perhaps other parts of the recommendation. I want to turn it back to you.
Bertrand, can I just jump in real quick? I just wanted to note that the description of the project is studying agency processes for providing written guidance in response to requests for advice from members of the public. So just wanted to note that.
Okay. And so it would be a rather large change to add oral. Even though it's just 4 letters here, it's a bigger change to the report. Is that what you're suggesting, Ben?
Yeah, it's not within the scope of the description of the report or of the project, sorry.
Okay. Okay. In light of that information, any sort of feedback or objections? Bill, yes.
I don't think we should put oral in there. It's again beyond the scope, and also it raises a host of different issues. We're talking about relatively formal responses to people, and oral guidance can be, it's just a phone call, and it's just a whole different ball of wax. So I don't think we want to get into that. We should distinguish, and I think Ron's addition of priorities and nature of mission would give a sense of, when you are going to do it by written guidance. You should give written guidance when, in light of all these things, it's appropriate.
Right. So maybe in terms of the limitations on what agencies and their resource priorities and mission can address the concerns that people have with respect to written guidance, is what I'm hearing in that comment. I guess I want to just say, ask Shalini, if she has any concerns with adding the additional caveats, for lack of a better term right now, to consider the priorities and nature of the agency's mission as part of their assessment as to whether to issue written guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives agencies a good amount of latitude if they have reasons, why they've decided it's not worth it for them to do. I think, that gives them the freedom to do that. And I don't know that we need to, or that the committee would want to come out with a really strong stance on, sort of saying everyone should be providing it, because I think my report pointed out that some agencies, their organic statute contemplates that they're going to be providing advice or individualized guidance, and for others, it's purely discretionary. So then the idea that, of taking a strong position that they should be doing it when it's actually, legally speaking, it's up to them. I think this gives a good amount of latitude for agencies to make that judgment.
Thank you. So in light of the scope of the report, I'm going to recommend that we delete oral, unless there are objections to that decision. Yes, David.
I have an alternative suggestion.
Okay.
Suppose we take out the written or oral and word it something like this. In response to requests from members of the public, that is guidance regarding, start again, from members of the public, that is guidance, comma, whether formal or informal, as to how the law applies. That's a distinction that's explained a little bit in the preamble now, and maybe that's the best way to handle it.
Okay.
Preamble gives examples.
Right.
Formal and informal mean.
Thanks for that suggestion, David. Are there any sort of thoughts or comments on that proposed amendment to the first recommendation? Yes, Ray.
I think that's a really good recommendation. We do provide guidance. We kind of have different levels of it. And so there certainly is a decision going on within our agency about whether this is something that we need to do some sort of formal individualized response to, which requires a certain procedure that we go through, or something more informal. In fact, we have different categories of them on our website. We've got informal letters, and then we have formal opinions. And so those are, I think that's a good distinction to have in the recommendation for sure.
Thank you, Ray. Timothy.
Yeah, hi. Not to directly contradict my colleague from EOC, but we really disfavor the term formal guidance. Formal and informal are terms that refer to rulemaking, not guidance. I mean, I understand the intent, but there's no, we don't view there being a such thing as formal guidance. That sounds like binding, and we don't apply that. I would say if the concern is limiting this, it might be good to reference down to recommendation 5. So something like individualized guidance in response to requests from individual members of the public submitted in accordance with recommendation 5, or how the agency implements recommendation 5. I think we're all in agreement that with the intent of what's going on here, what folks are looking at, but we don't like the formal informal distinction in guidance, which sounds to me like kind of like binding or non-binding, or mandatory or voluntary. I mean, those sorts of, those terms just don't fit well, at least the way we do guidance. Right. Even though there are different levels of formality associated with the process and guidance, and I think we all agree on that, but those terms are, I don't like the way we don't generally like them as they apply to guidance.
Okay. Timothy, could you repeat the suggested?
Oh, it was just coming up on the spot, but I think it is the request from individual members of the public. I think what we're talking about here is the requests from members of the public that the agency receives through the guidance procedures. Should the agency establish guidance procedures consistent with recommendation 5? I'm not sure how best to phrase that, but right. I mean, this gets into the point of, I think, one of the things that jumped out at me at this recommendation in general that we've been talking about is that it's really prioritizing a particular type of individualized guidance, just to say written guidance that receives some sort of significant level of clearance within the agency. If the agency is supposed to provide written guidance, it would be good to funnel those requests in a way, and I think recommendation 5 does a pretty good job of kind of asking the requester to say, like, do you really want a formal written, I used formally, I didn't like the term, but do you want a more formalized written response, or do you just want someone to tell you something like in 20 seconds on the phone? I think that helps narrow what folks are looking at here into being, because it gets into a lot of the other questions on like recommendation like 3 goes the reliance issue. That really only matters when you have guidance that's written anyway. You can't have other groups relying on oral guidance unless you're putting up the like the recording or something like that. But yeah, I mean, maybe I think that might be this general idea of kind of funneling this down through recommendation 5 as a way to limit the reach of what and when GAGAS is recommending agencies provide written guidance would be helpful. I think it gets that.
Okay, thank you, Timothy. I appreciate it. Kind of think about sort of what that language should look like. I'm trying to work on it through my head. Come back to you, David.
I promise this is my last word on this subject. But in response to the comment about formal having a special meaning in some context, following the wording of the preamble, how about saying relatively formal or informal?
I'll turn it over to Timothy if you have a thought or response to the idea of relatively formal.
Yeah, it's a simple recommendation. I think it helps because but
it doesn't address your concerns. I sense from your reaction.
Yeah, I just like, it's funny because like I know problem is formal and informal have meaning like in rulemaking, right? Like we all know. And I don't like perfectly like using those words in response in relationship to guidance. Obviously, like, I think everyone knows what you mean. We're not, we don't think formal guidance is like, you know, including like hearings. But, you know,
Okay,
it helps.
thanks, Timothy. Bill.
I was wondering if one way of dealing with it would be to specify what the guidance we're talking about is in response to requests for written guidance. I mean, it's in my experience, the request for, you get oral requests, you get oral guidance. If you want a written response, you give a written request and asking for a written response. And that might be a way of sort of limiting, saying, if somebody requests written guidance, then consistent with these agency priorities, et cetera, agency should provide written guidance as defined here. So I just wonder if that'd be a way of sort of getting rid of the formal, informal, and getting rid of oral at the same time.
Okay, so agencies should provide individual guidance in response to requests from members of the public for written guidance.
Yep.
We'll stop. For written guidance. It could still say regarding how the law applies to the requester's specific circumstance.
Exactly. I would start off this sentence by saying, in response to requests from members of the public for written guidance, agencies should, consistent with the agency resources, priorities, and nature of the mission, provide written individual guidance, that is written guidance regarding how the law applies to specific circumstances.
Bill, could you just give that to me one more time to make sure I'm capturing it?
Yep. In response to requests from members of the public for written guidance, agencies should, and then consistent with
agency resources
and the priorities. Now we got to go back to Ron's language. Agency resources and priorities and the nature of the mission, nature of the agency's mission, and then provide individual guidance then strike out in response to requests from members of the public, and then keep the dash, and keep the dash, yeah, and then put back written in, that is, keep the written.
So that is
okay, yeah, and put back written. I can also undo all this, so it'll be okay.
And then take out the relatively formal informing, and then
and take out this whole text here.
Yeah.
Got it.
Exactly. So let's see how folks sit with that. While people are sitting with that and reading it, I'll turn it over to Nina. Bill, do you have anything else you want to add?
No.
Okay. Oh, Nina put her hand down.
No, I
Nina,
put it
okay.
down because you called on me.
Sorry.
Super quickly, I think this is an excellent change to paragraph 1, and it also helps us with the scope problem. I don't think we should be incorporating, expressly incorporating any of the other paragraphs in the recommendation, because then this just says, in these settings, this is what agencies should do. So I think this is a great change, and I hope it'll help us with the scope issue.
Thanks, Nina. Matthew.
Actually, my comment is now moot after hearing Nina and after the incorporation of Bill's amendment for change. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have these changes to the first recommendation. Are there any objections to these changes? All right, we will write that up and clean it up and put it in the next set of recommendations that are sent to you. So let's move on to recommendation number 2. Any thoughts or comments on recommendation 2? Yes, Nina.
I just wondered what this was aimed at. I was confused by the language. if somebody could speak to that, I would appreciate it. My understanding is just generally guidance isn't there to create binding standards. At the same time, there is a theme in the report about how, as a matter of enforcement discretion, people who get written guidance should expect that enforcement authority isn't going to be exercised against them. It's something of a shield. So what's being ruled out in this paragraph 2?
I don't know, Shalini wants to speak on this, or Ben wants to speak on paragraph 2.
It shouldn't be used as a sword.
Right. I mean, I think that from what I'm reading, and maybe this is wrong, I'd be curious in terms of whether this account is right. It's really Xing out the use of individual guidance as quasi or declaratory orders that, in a sense, bind the public in ways that individual guidance aren't intended to do. But I don't know if that's the right characterization or not. Ron and then Kevin.
So with 2019-1, the word binding caused so much confusion during committee deliberations that we made a conscious decision not to use it as an operative term in any of the recommendation. And explain because it has different meanings to different people. In this context, it might be that you don't even need that phrase. You could say agencies should not use individualized guidance to create standards with which non-compliance may form an independent basis for action, etc. And then you would circumvent this question about standards that are used as a shield.
Got it.
Which is not within the intent of paragraph 2, although it is within the purview of the overall project.
So it's essentially saying, if you eliminate that language, it's essentially saying that individual guidance cannot be used as an enforcement tool. Would that be a right characterization?
Roughly, yeah.
Kevin.
As a sword.
As a sword, right. Kevin.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Ron was saying. I was going to, to me, the word use, I wonder whether we mean, because, phrase or speak in, that some of like the OMB's circular on the final best practices with good guidance, rules out certain words. I wonder whether, we could exchange the word use. I don't know. I don't have a better phrase, and maybe also that, and then say that purport to create, because I don't think we would say that they could create legally. So they shouldn't be phrasing them the way that purports to create standards for which non-compliance would serve. So those are not exactly wordsmith, but a couple of suggestions just to float.
Okay, so the agency should not use individual guidance that purport to create standards with which non-compliance may form, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and then use, I still feel like it's kind of a little vague. It's really about they shouldn't write individual guidance that they shouldn't incorporate within their individual guidance something. I don't have it quite. Someone will have a better, Ron will have a better phrasing if he likes the idea.
So let's play with that term use if people have suggestions. Nicholas.
I just want to say most of this language is drawn verbatim from recommendation 2017-5, which is the recommendation on general statements of policy. And I mean, I think its purpose, Bertrand, was what you said a few minutes ago, that these are not to be viewed as declaratory orders where, just violating the individualized guidance per se is sufficient as a basis for an enforcement action. An enforcement action would have to be built from the ground up on the basis of the statute or the regulations and so forth. So I'm assuming that's what this is kind of meant to do. But I mean, as Ron pointed out, when you talk about interpretive rules as opposed to general statements of policy, the question of what is binding and so forth becomes more fraught, which is why in the in the recommendation on interpretive rules, all that language was taken out. So I'm not exactly sure what to do here, but I think that's got to be the origin of why this was put in the first place.
Thanks, Nicholas. Bill.
I am happy with the changes that have been made and explanations for it. That raising somewhat different issue, which is how would this guidance affect application of the rule of lenity? In the sense that it's not an independent basis for an action, but it doesn't eliminate a question as to what the agency's interpretation is or what the interpretation is. So, I mean, it eliminates a certain amount of question that would otherwise be in the person's mind, the requester's mind. And I'm not being very articulate here, but I mean, the rule of lenity says if it's unclear, then we can't hold it against you. And legislative regulations or legal regulations can eliminate that ambiguity. Can these individual guidance documents eliminate that ambiguity? That's a question that I'd ask somebody to speak.
Okay. Ron.
Yeah, I think of lenity as a judicial concept. Not, I mean, if you're talking at the agency level, the answer is right clearly to say what you mean. Lenity only comes in when it's some other interpreter trying to decide what the agency meant to do. On the more general point, speaking to Kevin's point, I think the word you want to use here is agencies should not treat them as creating binding obligations. It's not what they purport to do when they're written. It's how the agency behaves when it has this guidance document and gives it a more draconian or a rigid application than the nature of guidance allows.
So if
so it would say should not treat individual guidance as creating standards with which noncompliance may form.
Okay, so it should not treat individual guidance as standards as
creating standards
as creating standards
with which noncompliance. I mean, standards with which is a very ungrammatical or awkward phrase, but I haven't been able to think of anything better. And I think it does come from the prior recommendations also. I didn't like it then either and couldn't think of anything better.
Right.
But I think you can get the point.
Okay. Okay, that gives us better guidance in terms of the general orientation of this particular recommendation, and we could deal with the other smaller wordsmithing issues in the committee of style. Are there any other suggestions with respect to recommendation 2 before I ask if there are any objections to the changes? Yes, Nina.
Just looking back at that original recommendation that Nick drew our attention to, I think one of the reasons this sentence became confusing was because of the addition of, or because of the specific mention of the requester as distinct from other members of the public. So I wonder if the Committee on Style could work on streamlining that a little bit. I can understand why requester is called out separately, because maybe the agency is going to let the requester use a written guidance as a shield. But even so, that made this paragraph quite hard to process.
Okay. So it would be that last line of the requester and other members to see if we can streamline that. Okay. Thank you, Nina.
Thanks.
Any other suggestions with respect to recommendation 2? Okay, so are there any objections to recommendation 2 as rewritten, subject to the fact that it will be further revised by the Committee of Style to clean up the language? Okay, let's move forward to recommendation number 3, and we'll go with the preamble to recommendation 3 and A and B before moving down to the rest. Yes, Timothy.
Thanks. So I think there's a big difference between allowing the requester.
I'm sorry to jump in real quick. Bertrand, I just wanted to mention that, and Tim knows this. Tim, I believe you're not a member of the committee
Oh, yeah,
or
yeah,
an
yeah.
ACUS member, so we just want to make sure we follow protocol regarding speaking privileges. So I just wanted to note that. I'll jump back out.
Here for Dan Cohen, who's a member of ACUS but not on the committee. So I don't know what that means. So an alternate, I guess.
Oh yeah, so you would say you're an alternate for Dan Cohen,
For
who's
Dan,
an
yeah.
ACUS member. Okay, got it.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have clarified that at the beginning. So I just I think there's just a big difference between allowing the requester to rely on individualized guidance and for the other individual. And you can look at 3E, which talks about when someone else can. But I think the way we view this generally is, it's a facts specific inquiry, right? So the requester will ordinarily tell us some amount of the facts, maybe not all of them, but at least the ones that are provided to us. And then the agency will respond to, with some boilerplate of like, based on the facts presented or whatever. So when it comes to other people to rely on that, it's a little dicier. I mean, the agency will, I think, generally strive to treat similarly situated people the same, or at least similarly. But I mean, and so I don't have a problem with this idea that sometimes maybe there's a potential for other requesters to rely, if not on the guidance exactly, but at least on being treated similarly. I don't have a huge problem with E in general, but I just feel like they're kind of different circumstances. We do want, right, if the requester, when the requester provides information to us and we respond, the assumption is that like our response is kind of binding on us, right? Because we've said, here are the facts you've told us, here's our view on that. When it becomes someone else, right, the factors always sort of change, or the facts always change. So that's just, I don't know if it's worth having separate numbered recommendation for other individuals, but I do want to make clear, folks, that it's a kind of a different thing.
Thank you, Tim. I wanted to bring in Shalini in terms of her experience interviewing members of agencies and their assessment of reliance interests of requesters versus other individuals that are not the requester. Was there I think your report does talk about reliance interest, but was there that separating out the two and in terms of their treatment or their expectations with respect to reliance interests?
Yeah, I think there was some variation. There's some agencies that I think for certain forms of individualized guidance make it clear that only the requester can rely on the guidance. But then there's some that are that contemplate third-party reliance if the facts are similar enough and it's in the statute or the regulations, that idea of the possibility for third-party reliance. So I guess there was some variation.
Thank you, Shalini. We'll go to Bill.
I think what's missing from 3, or what should be added, is a requirement or a recommendation that agencies should make clear in their written guidance to what extent a requester or other individual can rely on the guidance. I mean, I looked through it and I couldn't find anywhere where we say, once you've decided whether or not there is whether requesters, this is under
this
is under 5, the procedural recommendation.
Okay. Do you think that needs to be moved up, or?
I mean, it seems to me it comes in right at the point where when you're deciding whether or not people should, which is what 3 is, when you're just deciding whether or not people can rely, that clear in your written guidance.
Okay. So a possibility, a suggestion that we should move up perhaps the recommendation about agencies making clear to what extent a requester or other individual should rely on the guidance is a suggestion that's made by Bill. Kevin.
Yeah, this Let me lower my hand, sorry. I wonder whether we should begin this. This doesn't directly pertain to bills, although it may help. Which is, right now we have agencies should determine whether. I was wondering whether we should say agencies should develop policies regarding or policies stating when and whether, or because it really, I feel like these are all about. We're asking. I think if an agency was to respond to this, I think they would they wouldn't just in each individual guidance tell us whether. They would have to develop a general policy, or sometimes it's phrased later in the recommendation, a procedure. So I guess should develop policies regarding when and whether it's appropriate. And then separately, maybe Bill's point about whether each individual guidance should also indicate. I don't know about that, but I think that to develop policies regarding when and whether it's appropriate to allow. That seems like it. Anyway, I'm offering that as a suggestion.
So that last part, Kevin, I didn't quite catch. So agencies develop policies regarding when and whether it is, or whether when it is appropriate to allow a requester. Is there an amendment, or other individuals, is there an amendment to that aspect of it as well, Kevin?
No. I guess maybe I'm just making this suggestion and not directly responding to what Bill said.
Okay. And so I guess I'll turn it back to Bill in terms of, would that be responsive, or would you want more language, or perhaps an entire separate recommendation?
Well, 3 just doesn't address my concern, which is to assure that each individual guidance letter or document makes clear to the person who's getting it whether they can rely on it or not. I completely agree with Kevin about number 3. I mean, we're talking about policies generally, but the person who's getting the guidance should not have to figure out what the policy is. They should be able to know right from the face of their document. And I just think it should go right after 3. So it should be like the new 4 to say what is buried in 5 now.
So it would be agencies should inform requesters or other individuals to what extent they can rely on individual guidance.
Yeah, although I would that makes it sound like, again, something in a rule. Generally you can do it, or generally not. I wanted the actual document that they're receiving.
Got it. The individual guidance that the agency produces should inform requesters or other individuals to what extent that they can rely on the guidance.
Subject to the committee on style. Yeah, that's right.
So that's a recommendation, and you suggest, and Bill, that would be before recommendation 3. You think a separate recommendation, or
after 3 would be for new 4.
Okay. So let's kind of keep that language here for now as we work through the rest of 3, and we'll come down to after 3 whether to include this as a 4th recommendation. Are there any other comments on recommendation 3? I mean, we'll just kind of go A through G because I think they're also linked. It's hard to separate them out. Any other comments or feedback on recommendation 3, A through G? Yes, Ron.
This is more a committee on style point, but when the committee drafts it, you surely don't want to draft it in a way that implies that the document should run through all the factors listed, A through K or whatever it is. I'm sure that's not intended, and you wouldn't want it in the document. And it's just a matter of writing it clearly, because I think as constructed, the sentence seems to suggest that, which I'm sure you don't mean.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Any other comments or feedback on 3?
Well, one way to, if you rephrase 3 to be sort of agencies should develop policies in developing policies regarding whether it's appropriate to allow a requester to rely, agencies should consider the following factors. I mean, that makes it clear that the factors are going into making the policies, responding to Ron Levin's point. So it would be agencies in developing policies regarding.
So I heard you the first time. It said in developing policies regarding whether and when it is appropriate to allow a requester or other individual to rely on individual guidance, an agency should consider the following factors.
Right. Okay. In developing policy. Yeah. Should consider.
Agencies should consider.
Well, wait, no, regarding
after the comma.
After the exactly. So instead of considering factors, it would be should consider factors.
Agencies should consider, yeah, or should consider factors. Got it. Yep. Jeffrey.
Well, now we don't recommend that they develop policies.
Explain more.
Well, I mean, in 3, the way it was written originally, agencies should develop policies, and now it's when they're developing policies, they should do this. So we've taken out the recommendation that they actually should develop policies.
Okay.
Policy statement. So.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
How about going back to the original language instead of saying, and so say agencies should develop policies, whether when it's appropriate to, by considering factors.
Okay. By considering factors.
Yeah.
So they should develop policies.
Okay.
Just should develop.
Agencies should develop policies regarding whether and when it is appropriate to allow a request or other individual to rely on individual guidance by considering factors, including. Okay.
How about it? And in so doing, considering factors or some.
Fine.
Jeff, could you clarify where you want that in so doing inserted?
Instead of by.
Say one more time.
Instead of by, say.
Oh, got it. Oh, instead of, got it.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna move us forward to recommendation 4, and we'll still play with that language. It may not end up being that language, but the point was taken in terms of making sure that agencies understand that we are recommending that they develop policies, and then in doing that, in the process of developing policies, consider these factors. So we'll work on the exact language. Okay. Any objections to category 3 or recommendation 3 as written, subject to amendments by the Committee on Style? So let's move forward then to recommendation 4.
We're adding Bill's new one.
Oh, yeah, so the question is, will we add sort of Bill's language here? And the language would be, I guess Ben has it written down. And it would be, I guess it would be, I'll ask Bill in terms of clarify, should inform requesters and individuals and other individuals, or just requesters?
Well, I think we should I would say the agency should include in guidance provided to requesters whether they or others or to what extent they or others may rely on that guidance.
So notice in 4E, we sort of assume that there can be some reliance. So maybe the content of E should be moved down into this new 4 somehow. The content in 3E.
Okay, so it could be, so agency should in guidance provided to requesters. Let's finish this part first, and then we'll come back to E shortly. So let me just kind of finish with your language, Bill, to make sure we have it right. Agencies should include in guidance provided to requesters to what extent they or others can rely
on that guidance.
On that guidance, okay. And then we could add E as a second sentence to 4, because if it's a, we need a B.
I think I don't think so. I think it should say in 3. I think that this is part of the factors you take into consideration in whether or not others should be able to rely on it. I mean, the only thing that 4, I mean, it's going back to Ron Levitt's point, which is we don't want the individual guidance document to go through a list of factors or something. It just should say, you know, whether and to what extent. To what extent may be only if the facts are exactly the same, or only if this is the same. But that's covered by the to what extent they or others may rely on it. I think the E should stay in 3 because it's part of the factors considered for the policy.
But shouldn't it be revised somewhat? And it just sort of assumes that there's going to be reliance. So whether a person other than the requester may rely on it, which might depend on the similarity of the person's circumstances to the requester's circumstances, something like that. 3E.
Is this Jeffrey? Is this in addition to 4 that you're?
Oh, I mean,
or is it a change to what is in E?
It's changed to what is in E, because if Bill wants to leave it in E, then I think just the intro to it needs to be adjusted. This is a factor that the agency should be considering. And so I would say something like whether a person other than the requester may rely on it, which might depend on the similarity of the person's circumstances, something like that.
So whether a person other than the requester may rely on it.
Yeah. And then just say something like, which might depend on the similarity of the person's circumstances to the requester's circumstances. That's my thought.
Okay, so let's kind of scroll back up to 3 as a whole, so we could sort of process this and incorporate this into the entire recommendation to see how it fits and see if there's any comments. Okay, I think those are good suggestions, Jeffrey. Are there other thoughts on comments on that proposed edit to E? Any objections? Okay, so in the absence of objections, we'll move back down to 4 again, and then we have this new number 4 and come back to Kevin.
Yeah, just really small point. I think we probably need individualized guidance in the 4th line there.
Okay, so individualized guidance. Okay. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah. Any objections to including 4, a new number 4 in the recommendation? Okay, so let's move forward to recommendation 5. Okay, Bill.
I would add after the word parties on line 84,
Okay.
who relied on the guidance. Comma.
So comma after guidance.
Yes.
Okay. And Bill, I mean, yeah, Ben, do you mind adding the comma right after guidance on line 84? Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I was multitasking.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Sorry. Okay. Is that, Bill, is that a lingering hand or another comment? Okay. Any other suggestions with respect to recommendation 5? Yes, Ron.
Maybe I'm just not getting what other people are understanding, but I'm a little lost here. If the agencies don't allow you to rely on the guidance, then what are they doing, taking steps to minimize hardships on people who did rely, which is not allowed? Something here is not communicating to me as
Are we saying that they should not rely on the guidance? Because I think that number 4 just puts forth a recommendation about the extent to which they or others can rely on that guidance. I thought that there is some reliance that we are accepting that people can have on the guidance. Is that wrong?
Well, let me respond to Ron. I mean, I think the point of the old 4 and 5 was to say, even where you're told you can't rely on it, nevertheless, people will act on the basis of this guidance. All right. And therefore, the question is, you don't get a free pass because you can't rely on it. But at the same time, we may have misled you a little bit, even though we told you can't rely on it. And so maybe we should reduce penalties or do something else. But it's the idea is that at least the parties should have acted in reliance on the guidance that they weren't supposed to rely on in order to get the benefit of any softness in penalty. I think that's the idea behind this recommendation.
Yeah, I understand more clearly what you're saying, Ron. Sorry, I misunderstood.
But can I just ask Bill, I mean, isn't it, if the agency's policy is generally not to allow parties to rely, then, I mean, it's not, if the party was told expressly you can't rely on it, and then they relied on it.
Right.
That's what Ron's concerned about.
Maybe.
Well, I understand that, but the thing is that because of the new 4, the individual guidance will say to them whether they can rely or not. So assume it said you can't rely on this, right? Nevertheless, this is our guidance, right? Now we may change it, right? You can't rely on it. It hasn't been vetted at the highest possible level of the agency. It's like a no action letter at the SEC, all right? I mean, they're told they can't rely on it, but they sure as hell do. Now it's maybe instead of saying who relied on the guidance, to say who acted in accordance with the guidance.
Who nevertheless.
Okay, who nevertheless acted on the guidance. Because, I mean, if the agency is giving the guidance, they do expect people to act in light of it.
Yes,
in
Ron.
conf-
I think maybe my worry could be alleviated if the initial clause said something more like, even if the guidance provides that parties cannot necessarily rely or should not, does not assure people that they can rely or something like that. So it's, the way it's phrased now, it seems like it's forbidding you to do it. And then they're trying to help you if you did it anyway. And that's not what it means. Even if they, if the guidance itself said you can't necessarily rely. Nevertheless, as Bill says, they will do it, and some generosity is owed toward them.
Shalini, I was wondering if you could offer at least me a clarification as to in what context, in terms if this came up in interviews, in what context do agencies issue these do not rely recommendations or suggestions, and if they do offer these, how do they phrase them?
Yeah, so I think the example that comes to mind right away is private letter rulings from the IRS. And they are very clear that the requesting party can rely on the determination made in that letter, or the analysis in that letter, but that others may not, even though they're publicly available, and others, of course, are free to consult them. But I think they can't, invoke them as sort of shields in enforcement and that kind of thing. So I think I probably have to look to the regs to see the sort of the way that that's worded, but that's a example of
Got
that.
it. Got it. So this is guidance to the requester that says the requester can rely on it, but other individuals may not rely on the guidance. Okay.
in that case, our new number 5 only refers to parties. And who's a party? Interesting question. It's that I assumed it was only the requester, not
Yeah, that's why I was trying to
third
clarify.
persons.
Right.
So that should be clarified. We mean that to be anybody. And instead of do not allow, maybe Ron's suggestion about if agencies do not provide for persons to be able to rely on individualized guidance.
I mean, I think I'd like clarity here on this recommendation that it's referring to non-requesters. Because I think that this is what it's about.
Well, it's both requesters and non-requesters.
But do agencies issue individual guidance, Shalini, that say requesters should not rely on it?
Oh, you betcha.
I'm asking Shalini in terms of.
Well, I'd be interested in Bill's examples that he's thinking of, because I don't think I had. I mean, I think maybe I had an example of an agency that did some email advice, and that might be a situation where maybe
how about SEC no action letters?
Yeah, like the ones that are just sort of an expression of enforcement discretion versus sort of interpretation, I guess. Yeah, no, that's right. They do say you're absolutely right. So there is so we didn't talk to anyone at the FTC, but there is a case talking about sort of low-level staff advice letters that really are kind of informative, but not to be relied on. So I think you're right. We just didn't talk to people in an agency producing those kinds of letters, but I think that they do exist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So recommendation 5 should refer to both requesters and non-requesters then, based on that SEC no action letter example. Let's kind of turn back to Bill in terms of the suggested language change to number 5 to.
Well, I thought by saying using the word person rather than parties, persons would include both requesters and non-requesters. And if the agencies do not provide for a person to rely on individualized guidance, agencies should minimize hardship on persons who nevertheless acted in conformity with the guidance. That's looks good to me.
Yes, Ron.
Maybe the operative clause should say agencies should consider minimizing hardships. I don't think you want to give too much of a free pass to someone who was told you can't rely on this,
Yeah.
decided to do anyway, and then the agency's been told they must minimize hardships. Maybe the person was too adventurous in this
agree.
reliance that they're told they're not allowed to do anyway, or they're not
I agree.
expected to do anyway.
And the language where appropriate and lawful is not sufficient to.
Oh, I see.
I mean, I don't know. We could leave and consider, but do you think where appropriate and lawful is not enough of a qualifier?
Oh, I see. I think it's misplaced.
Okay. Should where
If you
appropriate.
move it up to
Yeah.
agencies should, where appropriate and lawful, minimize hardships.
Okay.
I think it would work.
Got it. Delete the other one. Okay. Okay. Any other suggestions with respect to recommendation? New recommendation number 5. Any objections to recommendation 5 as written, as rewritten, revised? Okay, so let's move forward to recommendation number 6. And this is under a new section on individual guidance procedures.
And Bertrand, as you know, Nina had a written comment in the chat, and I will add it to as a comment.
Great, thank
to
you.
the document, so we can consider it because she had to leave early.
Great, thank you, Ben. So that will be added to the comment as you guys are reading. Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, I had 2 quick points. One was really stylistic, which is now we have a heading that says individual guidance procedures, but we've edited the recommendation above to require agencies to develop policies. So unless there's a strong policy procedure distinction, I'm not sure the heading quite works the way. So I don't think we necessarily need to take committee time on that.
Okay.
But and the second thing is I'm sort of unsure. I like Bill's addition of, I think it's number 4. I don't know if Ben, you can show that. I'm still unsure whether it should be freestanding or some version of it should be stated as in where it was in K, because this is basically procedures. I guess maybe it's different. Here in 4, it's saying you should include this statement, and the procedures is you should just develop procedures that address this. So there's a different import, but I think there's some logic to having the agency think about, I don't know, to not say anything about reliance in the one we're talking about now, which is new 6, also seems a little odd. So I just want to raise that to the committee. Here we're talking about developing written procedures for requesting and issuing. And part of the procedures would be, I guess, stating expressly, but I don't have a,
Yes.
I don't have a clear yet. I just think there's something should be said about reliance here. Maybe we would just keep K.
Okay.
I wasn't meaning to take it out.
Yeah, okay, good.
So if we kept K, Kevin, would that address your concerns, or would you want something else or some other movement?
I think that would address my concern. Sorry to ramble.
Oh, no. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah.
And Kevin, I want to make sure I got you. You made a comment on the heading. I just want to make sure I understood that because I think I missed it.
Yeah, which is we say now above that the agency should develop policies on basically the extent to which there's reliance on, right? We say that in, I guess, number 3, right? And so now we have a new heading which says individual guidance procedures. I don't know whether it seems like if you were reading this quickly as an agency, you might skip over the fact that you'd previously had to develop a policy. I don't know whether we want to move the one that refers to reliance interest down and call this individual guidance procedures and policies, or just eliminate the heading.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something we can consider. I get your point.
Yeah. Okay, so given the length of this procedure, we'll go 6A through F in terms of reviewing, and then move down after that, or A through G. Yes, Bill.
In response to I guess it's Jeremy's question, that how should they make it publicly available? I think we should at least make clear that they should put it on their website.
And so Nina suggests in her comments are consistent with yours, Bill, that
oh, I see.
Yeah, publishing written procedures in the Federal Register and on their websites at a minimum. So yeah, I think that you two are very much aligned with that view. And so
just to clarify too, yeah, so Nina's recommendation was websites and Federal Register, and Bill, your recommendation was consistent with that?
Yeah.
At least the website was what I was saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then again, Jeremy's question is about, related to this Federal Register idea. I mean, I guess you could imagine procedures being published in the Federal Register, but not codified as regulations, like procedural regulations. But yeah, just want to make, so the options are, publication on website, publication in the Federal Register, and then also potentially publication in the CFR as codified regulations. Because they could be, those last two could be distinct, I guess.
And are there thoughts in terms of public availability? I think that, the website, there probably is broad agreement. What do folks think in terms of its publication as a procedure, publicly available procedure that would not be in the form of regulation and or as a regulation?
I certainly viewed them as procedural regulations.
See. Okay, so we could add that as so that would that be added as a additional subsection at 6 in terms of publicly available? I guess that's at the preamble preface.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just trying to fix that.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to figure out in terms of where to situate in terms of where they should be made publicly available.
Yeah, it seems like it would make sense to add it in some way to the opening.
To the opening, yeah, that's what I thought too. Yes, Bill.
I don't know if we're down to considering the individual parts in 6.
Yes. Yeah, we're going 6A through G, or whatever's on the screen at least right now.
I'm like Jeff Lubbers with respect to E. That is, I just find it very odd to think that the agency would charge fees. And I didn't know the IRS did, and I guess Shalini might tell us if there's other agencies in addition that she knows about who charge fees. And if they charge fees, is that something that's specifically authorized by statute as opposed to done on a discretionary basis? Because, I mean, I really would like to see recommendations that agencies should not charge fees for providing individualized guidance, even if we knew that some agencies did. It just seems to me wrong.
Yeah. Shalini, and also I guess I would add to the questions that Bill asked, were they charging fees because they needed the money to actually do this, or was it, did you sense it was a way to deter too many requests for advice?
So the sense I got is that the fees for letter rulings are really driven by the additional work on the agency. So The sort of higher dollar amounts for certain letter rulings, like complex corporate tax questions, were sort of, I think, closer to I think at the high end, 38,000 may have been the highest. But then simpler ones, are far cheaper. And in the interviews, it did come across like it was very much about funding the work that went into this. So.
And were they codified in these fee arrangements? Were they codified in statute or in regulations? Or
I'll have to check. My best guess is that it's not in the statute, just because I would imagine you need the flexibility to change fee schedules, over time. So I would imagine it's not fixed by statute, but I would need to double check.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very interested, because I thought, generally speaking, agencies were not authorized simply to charge fees on their own to pay for their own work, and that it required a statute to authorize such a thing. Now, the statute might not set the fees, but might authorize them to set the fees, because ordinarily any money gotten by the agency doesn't go to the agency, it goes to the general fund of the Treasury. So I'm a little doubtful about that, and pending clarification on that, I'd like to sort of bracket this thing, because when any fees the agency charges, I'd like to know if we think that they have the authority to do it on their own. This is really.
We have a whole recommendation on user fees.
And what's it say?
I haven't looked at it, but I mean, I think, I think there is some general legislation, some independent authorization law or something that allowed agencies to use user fees to recoup costs and things like that. But I think we need to make sure that this is not inconsistent with with our previous recommendation. And
okay, so we should look at our user fee recommendations and see whether this subpart is consistent with it. There's also the comment from you, Jeffrey, about modifying the language to perhaps say to allow agencies to charge fees. I think I don't want to sort of mischaracterize, but
if they're going to charge fees, they should allow waivers, sliding scales for different types of requesters, like FOIA does.
Right. So it could be that I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and perhaps make recommendations that are not appropriate here, but maybe that language allows us to not making any suggestions about charging fees or not, but rather if they are going to charge fees, that there be a waiver, sliding scale.
Or you could just say any fees.
Or any fees that are going to be charged, that there be a waiver, sliding scale.
If you wanted to make it less direct, that any fees and waiver policies, any fees the agency charges for providing individual guidance, along with policies for waivers or sliding scale of fees or something like that.
Yeah, and I see Matt's raising his hand, and we've got some language that we could draw from the recent user fees recommendations. So I think we could probably take that back and see to what extent we want to incorporate it and discuss next time. But I don't know if Matt had a similar thought.
Yeah.
I was just going to direct the committee to recommendation 1 in the user fees recommendation for consideration, as well as some considerations for agencies in 8, 9, 10, and 11. But I think Ben and I and others on staff can probably capture the intent of the committee here and poach language as appropriate from those locations.
Great. Thanks, Matt. That'd be great. And thanks, Ben. All right, so we're bracketing the E for now, and we'll come back to you with revised language that considers the user fees recommendation. That was put forth by ACUS. Are there any other comments on 6A through, I guess we have A through H on the screen?
I have one. I don't know if, I thought we were going to put something in the first line that said make publicly available at a minimum on the agency website or something like that.
Yeah, so I guess putting aside the substance, I mean, the procedural question is, do we want to have like a separate sentence that, here, that's what I was starting to write, that kind of says that? Do we want to somehow incorporate it up here? And then the substantive question for the committee is more, do we want to just say websites? Do we want to say something about Federal Register? Do we want to say something about the CFR?
Again, we've done this in a lot of different recommendations. So I think if you go back and look at the language,
Yeah.
you'll get some standard language for that.
Yeah, I guess that, so then we should still address the substantive question in terms of where. We could draw on language from other recommendations as to how to phrase this, but where do we think it should be made publicly available? Do folks have thoughts or suggestions on that point?
Well, I thought we'd sort of reached agreement that it would be websites, Federal Register, Code of Federal Regulations.
Okay. Any objections to that? Okay. Any other comments on 6A through H? If not, we'll move down to I and I through K and stop there because we're running out. We'll have to end our meeting with any suggestions or thoughts on I through K.
Just don't think K is procedural.
Procedure should describe whether requesters and others may rely. Good.
It's substantive. I think that's a policy issue. Going back to Kevin's framing remark at the beginning.
So would that suggest that you remove K and make it its separate item, or remove K and move it up to the prior section? What would be your suggested change based on that comment?
Maybe that 4 takes care of most of it, or it could be, if it's going to be said twice, it should be in 3.
And Kevin, I know you wanted it to be kept in 6.
Yeah, there's a reason to keep it in 6, and because what we put in 4 is what has to go in the guidance letter. This is the policy or procedure by which the agency is making all those consideration determinations. All right, and that's where those considerations are expressed publicly in K. That they've weighed those various considerations that are in recommendation 3, and put into this document that's going to be in the website and other places what the outcome of that consideration was. In other words, whether it should be whether and to what extent requesters may rely, because it's not just whether yes or no, it's also to what extent. Okay. But I mean, I don't see a problem with putting this under the title procedures. Yes, it is a policy that would be in these procedural regulations, but I don't think the title makes that much difference.
So I mean, I think that this could be functioning as a form of notification.
A notification of what the policy is, yeah.
Right. Ray.
For what it's worth, in EEOC's regulations on our own letters, what we do is outline the procedures that the letter has to go through in order for it to be something that can be relied upon. And so, it has to be decided by the commission, and it has to be signed by a certain person. And so all of the elements that have to be in that are in our procedural regulation about that includes, how you request an opinion from the commission. So I don't have a problem with it being in there, and so it's another way to provide notice to the public to look for certain elements, like, is this signed by the legal counsel of the agency, which is something, it's one of our requirements for it to be something to be relied upon. So for what that's worth.
Got it. Thank you. Right.
Oh, I think that's really, really good, important. And therefore, Kay's language should change. It's not whether to what extent they can rely, but the procedures by which requesters or the information that requesters must provide to support any request for reliance.
Yeah. It could be procedures for determining whether and to what extent requesters and others may rely on individual guidance in subsequent proceedings.
Great.
And be, yeah.
Did you say, I'm sorry, Bertrand, did you say whether and to what extent?
And to what extent, yes. Okay. That's Bill's suggested add.
Fine with me.
Okay. Yes, Ron.
I thought Bill was suggesting that this clause should tell people what they need to do in order to secure reliance, as opposed, the way it reads now, it's just passively looking at what the agency did and deciding whether you can rely on it. Maybe it should say about what conditions the requester has to fulfill in order to enable them to rely. If that's what you want, if that's the message, substantive message you want to convey, then that's would be one way to do it.
I'm gonna go back to Ray in terms of responding. Is it and describing the EEOC procedures? Is it about the conditions, or does that map onto your experience of how you give notice to people about reliance?
So the regulations just detail what's going to be in the letter for it to be something that can be relied upon. So so we try to be very careful for the signature line is one of those things that I can think of off the top of my head. So if it's signed by me as the associate legal counsel, can't rely on it. If it's signed by the legal counsel, our politically appointed legal counsel, then it can be relied upon if it was the subject of a commission decision. So, and of course, whether there was a commission decision and is something that is going to be addressed in the body of the letter itself. So, so it's basically outlining for the public, what has to be in that letter in order for someone to rely on it, and not necessarily what procedures the public has to go through in order for reliance, because they make the request and then we decide whether or not this is something that we're going to run through the procedures necessary to create reliance or not.
Yeah, got it. Thanks, Ray. So yeah, procedure for determining doesn't seem like the right way of phrasing it.
Yeah, so what I said was wrong, but you could go to the passive voice and say what conditions must be fulfilled.
Conditions must be fulfilled. The conditions must be fulfilled for persons
to be able to rely.
Okay.
Person is plural.
Yeah. So let's just take that language in. We have to kind of close the meeting. I'm not going to ask if there's objections to 6 yet. We'll start off next meeting discussing 6 and moving on through the rest. I want to thank all of you for everything you've offered today and for your attention to this particular set of recommendations. And we'll continue our next meeting going through the rest of the recommendations and turning to the preamble. Our next meeting is scheduled for Ben, I forgot.
April 24th.
Thank
10
you.
a.m.
April 24th, 10 to 1. We'll have the full 3-hour slot during that meeting. And Ben will be sending out the Zoom info and also requests for RSVPs over the course of the next week or two. Thanks, Jeffrey.
And Bertrell, as I mentioned at the outset of the meeting, we were looking at scheduling a third meeting, maybe the really early part of May.
Yes. Thank you, Ben. So we'll schedule a third meeting early part of May. We'll get that scheduled this week and we'll let you know when that meeting will occur. It'll also be a 3-hour meeting. So thank you all again. And I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Anything else that I'm leaving out, Ben?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thanks so much. I need all the hand holding I can get. Thanks everyone. And I'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.